Hello. My internet is kind of going in and out, so I hope it works for the rest of this talk. And I have a little bit of cold, so I'll try to keep my energy up as high as it normally is. So for all of you that have already had the pleasure of meeting me, if I feel a little low, I'm battling a cold. But my name is Whitney Rottman. I've been in ag since I can remember. I have real world experience on a variety of different kinds of farming operations, but mostly in the last, I would say 15 years, I've been a scientist in academia and corporate, really trying to commercialize biologicals in ag, whether that's cropping systems or like animal probiotics, animal feed, things like that. I have a unique set of experiences. I love to try new things. I've milked cows. I've worked at Tractor Supply. I've been a veterinarian technician. Really, I'm a research physiologist. I look how things work together. I have a master's in animal science, feeding dairy cattle, so a dairy cattle nutritionist. And then when I was a corporate research scientist, I was looking at the interactions between soil microbes and the plant. So I really just love this idea of complex matrices, whether it's the soil or the rumen, that are the home to billions of microbes. And how do those microbes interact with each other? How do they interact with the host? What can you do from a product development standpoint to influence those highly complex systems? And so that's just what I'm really passionate about and what I think I'm fairly good at. But I also just want to, everybody understand that these kinds of rumen systems or soil systems, they're so complex, and we know just a little bit about it. And that's where, there we go.
Well,
We're
Whitney,
going
I
to get
got
into
a question for you on the prior slide there. Why cows?
why cows. Oh, why cows. Um, I was going to be a veterinarian, and I had a lot of experience there. And my first introduction to cattle was food animal medicine, so livestock veterinarian practices. And I just loved the idea of creating a safe food supply for the humans, and keeping those animals in a really high well-being state, right? Um, and then I realized as a veterinarian, you don't get to do as much well-being work because you're called in usually for sick or some major situations. And the value of that animal is only the value of that animal at market per se, right? A farmer is not going to put necessarily more money into an animal that they can just get market value. So I found my impact to be nutrition, because the nutritionist really gets to come in and look at the whole well-being of a herd and gets to do things to help make sure that the animal never gets to the veterinarian. And so that's why I went to grad school, and just loved it. And I think dairy cattle are just giant dogs, and they're so lovey and they're so cuddly. And I had my favorite cow that would come running up to me in the barns, and I just fell in love with them as an animal, and just the complexity of them. Anything that's a challenge, I'm gonna take. So I can't do anything easy.
What I mean, and Holstein, Jersey, any favorites there? I know we've had this discussion, but you got to tell the world what you think.
Yeah, I love Holstein from a like pet perspective. I think they're just giant Labrador retrievers. They're so cute. I just love them as like cuddle buddies. But in terms of if I ever won the lottery and wanted to start a dairy farm, I'd probably go with Jerseys. I just think they're smaller, they have less health problems, they produce, I think, higher quality milk from a well-rounded standpoint, right? But they don't quite produce the volume. So the Holsteins are the volume, Jerseys are the milk fat and the protein, and plus they're also cute. So I can't see anybody because I'm only on one monitor. So if you have a question, just speak up. This is going to be a little bit of a dense topic.
Yeah, that's a good
And
point because I meant to ask you beforehand if you wanted people to ask questions during your presentation to hold them. A lot of times people put them in the chat box just to let you continue your sentences there, and then you can address them as needed. It looks like everyone's still awake. Most people are either smiling, nodding, or having some indication of life. So they're,
perfect,
I think they're still, you still got them.
perfect. Okay. This might be a little, I'm hoping that this talk is a little controversial. I'm going to push a little bit about the social norms that we have around methane and cattle. It is, I think, a very charged subject right now, and the industry in themselves is getting, I think, blasted with news headlines in general media, right? People that aren't associated with agriculture are seeing headlines like cow burps are a climate problem. Can seaweed help? Right? And they're doing masses of amounts of grants and funding opportunities and investors into this methane problem that we have with the cattle problem. The White House is getting involved, private equity, private investors, things like that. There's a massive amount of money going into this. And then you have the vegan movement that are kind of, going along with this, saying, no. I mean, cows are the problem, but let's just not fix the cow problem. Let's just eat less meat. Let's not eat meat, right? Let's just get away from cattle because there's such this problem in the world, right? And then you have government stepping in, and Denmark is charging farmers a burp tax, and I think another country, I'm trying to think, whatever, is putting a cap on the number of cattle farmers can have, so they have to cull cattle, and so it's getting it's very charged, it's very nuanced, and I just want to redefine the problem a little bit from my perspective, right? So we have greenhouse gas emissions. So if this pie chart is all of the greenhouse gas emissions and their role in the global order, right? So carbon dioxide is 80% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, right? It's still the majority of what is getting released into the atmosphere. Methane, the CH4, accounts for 11% of the greenhouse gas emissions, global greenhouse emissions, and then it's nitrous oxide, and then 3% of the other ones. So when we take that methane pie and then we look at the sources of that methane pie, so that 11%, right? And this is a little old. It's from the EPA. It's 2015, so I'm sure it's changed. But of that 11%, 31% is natural gas and petroleum systems. So again, it's pretty significant. 25% is the enteric fermentation, which I'm going to be talking to you today about, right? Only 25%, and then landfills, manure management, coal mining, and other. So I really want everybody, if you don't walk away from this talk with anything other than, when people are talking about cow burps, they're really talking about 25% of 11%. That's what they're talking about. And I think it gets overinflated, I think, in certain conversations. And that, I think, is my biggest pet peeve. Now, with that being said, methane is still super important. And I believe in product development, and I believe in working on some of these technologies, because methane has a 28 times more warming potential than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. It's called the GWP 100. Okay, so carbon dioxide is the baseline. That is one. And then over 100 years, they did the modeling, and it's 28 times more warming potential than methane, or than carbon dioxide. And it's a relatively short-lived GHG. So it doesn't sit around in the atmosphere as long as carbon dioxide. So yes, it's 25% of 11%. That's what we're talking about. And also, it is a good greenhouse gas to target right now, because it's more potent and because it's short-lived, it has the potential to see an impact in our lifetime, or at the very least, the next generation, if there's an impact there. So it's a yes and situation. Yes, methane is important, and we're only talking about a tiny piece of this whole pie. Any questions? Okay. So I'm going to jump into the meat of this. I'm going to go quickly. It's going to be a little bit deep. So just stop me and
Oh,
ask
take
questions.
your time. This is the stuff I live for.
Okay. Um, so ruminant versus monogastric. I think this is a great way to really look at what a ruminant is when you compare it to what a monogastric is. And a monogastric is just our digestive system. It's a pig, it's humans, cats, dogs, things like that. And then the ruminant is cattle, deer, giraffe, um, things like that. So a ruminant has a 4-chamber stomach. It's got the rumen, reticulum, omasum, abomasum. It's all one stomach with valves that open and close to let feed particles go through. It contains a fermentation vat, which is the rumen. It's really large. And then it goes to the glandular stomach that we have. So you have this fermentation that moves into the glandular stomach. And it relies on an array of microbes to provide the essential nutrients to the animals. That rumen is what the fermentation in that rumen is the thing that provides the nutrients to the animal. Contrary to that, we have the monogastric. It's just one glandular stomach. It's got acids and enzymes that breaks down the feedstuffs. Whatever you feed the animal, that gets broken down and absorbed. There's a little bit of microbial fermentation that occurs in the cecum at the very end, the back end of the animal. But it's at a very, very, very lower rate than a rumen, and it provides like the B vitamins and things like that that we need as humans or monogastrics. So with that being said, you're not feeding the cow. You're never feeding the cow. You're feeding the microbiome. You're feeding the microbes. And so this is just a little diagram I created. The thing on the right is not a brain, as my 4-year-old said. It's the rumen, just the rumen. So can you see my cursor or no?
Yep.
Okay, so the food comes in here, it goes into the rumen in the back, and these are the little microbes, and it does the fermentation, and microbes release byproducts, a waste, if you will, and their waste is some proteins, acetate, butyrate, amino acids, propionate, B vitamins. Some of it gets absorbed straight through the rumen wall, or it will move into the reticulum, omasum, and then the abomasum here is the glandular stomach. So anything that's big enough that makes it here, you get the enzymes and the acids break it down, and then the absorption really starts going, and then back here is the intestines, and the absorption takes place. So if you come over here to the kind of looks like a decision tree, you have this diet, and then you have most of it goes to the rumen fermentation. There is some bypass nutrients that can occur. This is a good area for product development. You can coat. There's bypass amino acids, bypass things. You can coat things that don't get broken down in the rumen that gets broken down in the acid. So some nutrients do bypass, but really you're feeding the rumen. The rumen creates these short chain fatty acids, which is over here, the butyrate, acetate, propionate. Then when the microbes die because microbes' life isn't that long, 24 hours to 36 hours. When they die, they move into the glandular stomach, and then when it gets there, the microbe itself is broken down, and that's where the cattle get their amino acids and their protein, is actually the microbes that die is the protein source, is the amino acid source. And then there's all these waste products, the byproducts of fermentation, carbon dioxide, methane, things like that gets produced. And then it just kind of goes through, and the animal ruminants have a unique way of building their nutrient profile in their body from a physiological standpoint. So this is just a lot of saying you're feeding the microbe, you're not feeding the cow. And so what does the microbe population look like? All right, this is just a really scary graph that shows the microbiome research has come such a long way in the last, I would say, even 5 years. And so this is a snippet of what the bacterial population looks like in one cow in a situation. And basically each color bucket, like at the top, each color bucket represents a grouping of bacteria. Okay. And I think this is really important because individual bacteria don't always mean something very important, but functional groups do. So you have a functional grouping of bacteria that will produce acetate. You have propionate producing bacteria. You have fiber digesting bacteria, protein digesting bacteria, methane producing bacteria. So they're all grouped, as you can kind of see in these bands. And that's what we look at when we study the microbiome. Just like the microbiome that we have, it shifts depending on type of animal, type of feed, geographic location, right? So you can take a cow feeding one diet and you can take a cow feeding a completely different diet, do this same, test, the microbiome exploration, and it's going to look completely different. Okay. And there's a lot of microbes, and this is this is not an exhaustive list. There is countless numbers of organisms that we haven't been able to identify yet. Same as in soil. There's things that we can't culture. There's things that we can't isolate. There's things that we just don't know about. So I expect the next 5 to 10 years that our library of microbes that we know about in the soil and the rumen is going to explode. It's going to be really cool. And so the rumen wants to be in balance. Each microbe group, that functional group that I was talking about, the acetate, the propionate, the fiber digestion, they have a combination of nutrients and conditions to thrive. The rumen is not a soup that is uniform. The rumen is a layered cake, if you will, of microenvironments. So at the very top of the rumen, you have really dry, new feed. And as you move down in the rumen, it gets wetter and wetter to where you get to the bottom where it's really soupy. And so there are microenvironments within the rumen that have pockets of microbes that thrive there. And these populations will increase or decrease depending on the conditions. And this increase and decrease can happen on a short-term period, so at 24 hours. There's a diurnal pattern of feed intake. That's my research is based on in grad school. We looked at the pattern of intake over the day. And so there's the starch and the fiber and the protein shifts throughout the day as the animal eats and as the rumen fermentation goes. And so you'll have the starch populations increase in the morning when the new feed is laid, and then you'll have the fiber populations increase in the evening when the starch is all gone. So you really have this fluctuation through the day. But then you can also have these long-term adaptations. I think some of us have heard it over 6-month period, where if you try to change something in the beginning, if you add a feed additive or you change your feed or you do something, you might see a really awesome response in the beginning. And then after a few weeks and a few months, that response might go away. And that's because the environment, the microbiome, the functional groups have changed to become in balance again. And this is the adaptation. This is what product development has to keep into account for. And some of these methane feed additives, there's a real question behind it. If you put it into the cow early, you might get a wonderful response in methane reduction in the beginning, but then by week 6, it might be gone because the microbes are living and they're changing and they're responding and they adapt to the environment. And then another really key piece of this puzzle is, because there's these functional groups, the byproduct of one functional group, the waste of one functional group, is usually something needed in another functional group, right? They're interlinked. They've evolved to fill niches, and these byproducts help it. And so when you remove or you try to eliminate one functional group, right, you're usually going to be affecting another functional group because they're relying on that byproduct. So it's all very complex. It's all interrelated, and it's a living, breathing organism ecosystem responding to environmental pressures.
So, I mean, just in short, you're saying don't go long on seaweed?
I'm not a fan. I think there is a lot of flaws in that. So yes. Yes, Yes, don't go long on seaweed. So when we're thinking about the interrelatedness of everything, this is why methane is crucial for maintaining the balance in the rumen. So you on the left here, we have the fermentation bacteria, and they're doing their thing and they're creating byproducts. Well, electrons are the currency within cellular respiration, whether it's anaerobic fermentation, aerobic respiration within our cells. It's the electrons is what cells use to generate the ATP that they use for the energy, right? And the electrons get passed from cell to cell via electron transporters. Think of electron transporters like a wallet, right? You put your currency, you put your bills in your wallet, and you carry your wallet around. Okay, so the wallet is this H2 that you see on the screen. So you have the fermenting bacteria, they're putting all their currencies in their wallets, and the wallets are building up. The energy is building up in the system. Well, then methanogens come along and say, oh, we need a way to harness that energy. We need a way to get that energy out of the wallets and useful. Otherwise, we're just going to have a system that's not in balance. And so methanogens have developed a way to harvest that currency through the production of methane. And so they take the H2, they take the carbon dioxide, they combine them, they create methane. And then the brilliant thing with methane is it volatilizes in the rumen and the cow burps it out. And so that cow is releasing all of that energy in the system. It's giving back these electrons to the atmosphere to allow that rumen system to continue to operate optimally. So when you take away the methanogens and you take away that methane, you're gonna have this massive buildup of H2 in the system that, pH can drop and it can have really detrimental effects within that energy system. Now, there are lesser pathways. You can form acetate. You see formate. Formate on the screen is another way, is another wallet. Acetate's another wallet. Propionate's another wallet, right? And so there are other pathways that we can really remove the energy from the system, but methane is the primary pathway, and it's an important pathway. So with that, we need to understand we can lower methane emissions in the cow or in the bovine, but we cannot eliminate it. So when I hear words out there going, we want to eliminate methane from cattle, we want to do this, I was like, I don't know, that's a surefire way to kill the animal, because then it's going to be, that rumen is going to be so unhealthy and unhappy that they're not going to be able to undergo fermentation. And so with that kind of idea, what is good enough, right? What is a good enough reduction, knowing that we can't eliminate it? We cannot strive for zero. And so I think that's another thing that this industry is wrestling with, is what level of low is good enough. And there are products on the market, and there's ways to reduce your methane emissions in cattle, which I think are very good. You have this 3-NOP, which is DSM's and now Elanco's Bovaer product. It is 3-NOP inhibits the methane pathway in methanogen. So it doesn't actually affect that microbe itself. It goes into it gets absorbed into the cell and stops the methane producing process. So I'll be interested to see what that does over the long term. They've only done a couple long-term studies. We don't know the full effects of it. There's no production effect. In certain cases, we see a decrease in milk production. In certain cases, we see an increase. You have to feed it every day. But from my perspective, this 3-NOP is the best feed additive I've ever seen come out of animal science research, in the sense of its effectiveness and its consistency. So I do think it's a really good product within certain situations. Seaweed, oh gosh, seaweed. It is seaweed. I'm trying to be careful here because I have very strong opinions about seaweed. First of all, we call it seaweed. It's only a red seaweed. it's actually a microalgae because it's there. It's not the stuff. It's not the kelp. It's not the kelp that you see floating in the ocean. It's this micro red algae that you grow, that you can grow in fermentation, or not fermentation. It's not a fermentation. You just grow in giant aqua containers, right? You just grow it in these giant aquariums. And so what we're doing is we're taking this algae, we're building these giant warehouses, we're putting giant tanks in there, and we're growing this microalgae, and we're feeding the cow with this feed additive. So it just seems wackadoodle to me. But what is really inhibiting the methane is bromoform. So the bromoform is inhibiting the binding between vitamin B12, the cofactor, and an enzyme. So bromoform is not a nice chemical by itself. So there's just a lot of there in the seaweed that I don't love. But it is the second most studied alternative to Bovaer. So people really like it. There's a lot of money in it. It's very popular. So it's viewed as natural, whereas the 3-NOP is viewed as synthetic. So there's just, yeah, these are the two leading technologies. There are microbial feed additives out there. There are ways to optimize or balance out the rumen and feed efficiency. So there's a lot of things we can do from a management standpoint. And my thing is if we really get the rumen in balance, if you really make that rumen fermentation the healthy as it possibly can be, then you're going to lower methane because you have more of an interplay between the functional groups, right? So I'm not sure it's always going to just take a product to do it. It could just take good management. Do I see some things in the chat?
So it was just more of a textual hand clapping from Kristen for using the phrase wackadoodle. It's one we haven't heard in a while, so we appreciate you bringing that back.
Oh gosh. Yes. So and this is how I'm going to end it, and I'd love to hear everybody's discussion. I call this the missing link, or are we missing the mark, carbon credits. When I am in product development conversations with companies that are trying to do feed additives with cattle and methane reduction, it's always hand in hand with, we're going to develop this product because we can get a carbon credit. And the carbon credit is going to pay for the technology at the farmer level, because I've not seen a product launched yet that gives a farmer both a methane reduction and an ROI in terms of milk or meat. So the biggest question right now is, who's paying for these technologies when there's no return? There's no return. And so everybody says, oh, it's carbon markets. It's the carbon credits. The carbon credits are going to pay for the product. We're not there yet. The current state of the carbon credits for methane, it's years and years out. They have, you have an inset, you have an offset. The offset is you go through these gold standards or Vera or the Climate Action Reserve, you get a project granted, the project gets validated and verified, and you measure, and then that carbon credit gets generated and given to the farmer for the farmer then to sell on the market. Or you have the inset, which is like Land O'Lakes will hopefully pay the farmer to use Bovaer, and then they'll pay a premium or whatever it is. The system isn't set up for that yet. First and foremost, there's only 2 methane methodologies that have been published. One through Vera and it's a Mutral, has a product. It's a garlic and lemongrass product. And so you have to use Mutral's product to even get qualified for this methodology. And I think it's even still in review. I don't even think it's ever really been approved yet. And then you have Gold Standard, has another one that was created by Cargill, but it excludes microbial feed additives, hormones, and synthetic growth promoters. So there's not even methodologies out there for most feed additives. The data, so from my experience, we're taking like carbon markets or carbon brokers that are used to the data of like a vehicle produces X amount of CO2, and that, you know, you remove a vehicle or you lower CO2 and there is a credit associated with that. That is it's a chemical process. It's very cookie cutter. You get the same data out of the system pretty much every time, right? A tree, think of a tree. A tree from a carbon standpoint is very easy to model. We know what a tree produces. We know what a tree removes from the atmosphere. So a carbon credit associated with planting trees or maintaining an area of a forest from a modeling perspective is very different than trying to model methane production in cattle globally. It's almost impossible. And so when we try to switch to that world, the data is so noisy. There's so much lack of consensus. The measurement piece is an issue. There is not a technology out there right now that anybody can agree on that is the best way to measure methane from a single cow or a single bovine, not to mention on farm level measurement. And our on farm level measurement is basically not even existing. So how are farmers doing this? There is no infrastructure in place right now for carbon credits, insets or offsets, to pay for these technologies. And then not to mention the lift on the farmer level. So let's just even pretend that there is a carbon credit that they're getting. The data lift from the farmer is also huge. The bookkeeping you need and all of the information, and it's just kind of, it's going to be equivalent to soil carbon and the soil credits. And we don't have a great way right now to support farmers with their data. It's all over the place. It's in a million different places. I know that's been a topic that we all talk about here too, right? The data infrastructure in ag, getting that in all in one place. And so I'll let you all decide whether it's the missing link or missing the mark, or if we really need to shunt more money into this carbon market to pay for these kinds of things. But I just want everybody to know we're just not there yet. And when I hear companies solely relying on this carbon system to support the ROI for their product, you know, it's my job to come in and say that's not a viable business solution today. So what's your plan? Here are some resources. I'll leave this in the presentation. So if you guys want to learn more about some of this stuff, you can just go there. And with that, I want to really open it up for questions and discussions.
Well, firstly, thank you so much. Is it possible to make the deck available for us, or is there anything there you want to make sure that you change before you give it to us?
I don't think so, but let me just do a double check on my stuff before I send it out into the world.
Sweet. I think this is going to be a very engaging post discussion here. I am going to give the microphone to Ewing, the man with the fewest words. So if he has after milking cows for 20 years, he might have a question or two or response.
So this is very complex. Not only as an industry as a whole, but also very species specific, as Whitney said. So there's no one answer on how we can pull all this together and like solve all the problems of the world. I would like to add a little bit, because I'm passionate about this, with aquatic plants, whether you want to call them seaweed or microalgae or whatever. They do have other opportunities to affect the food we eat. So before, there was a lot of research and opportunity to produce synthetic vitamins, minerals, and obtain those from other places. A lot of farmers fed aquatic plants to get the vitamins and minerals needed to feed the cattle, because it just wasn't available. Once they started feeding those, their production skyrocketed. It was based on, you know, the different micronutrients that were created that way. Of course, almost all aquatic plants have huge amounts of protein, and you can produce that at a cheaper rate than growing soybeans or other protein products that you can feed to animals. And lastly, almost all aquatic plants have high amounts of omega-3 fatty acids in them, which transfer into the animal and therefore can transfer into healthy food. Everybody knows eggland's best. They don't feed aquatic plants. They feed land-based high omega-3 seeds to theirs. But there's a herd of dairy cattle in Pennsylvania feeding high omega-3 foods, and they're marketing omega-3 milk. And when they first started bottling that milk, they were doing no fat, low fat, 2% in whole milk. And the mamas buying the milk said, we want whole milk, not, you know, the whole milk you and I buy, but what comes out of the cow. So that's all they bottle now, and they sell out every day because they want that omega-3 product for their children and themselves. So there's all these really difficult things when you talk about all this. In the feedlot, this might interest Keith. In the feedlot situation, they push those ruminants to a point where they're almost they suffer from acidosis, so they change their diet and put it in such a tilt that they don't produce a lot of methane, believe it or not, because they don't get enough fiber to ferment to create that methane. So there's this fine line of the way they feed beef animals that that doesn't create quite as much issue as, say, a grass-fed animal, where you're going to have a lot more methane produced just by what they're eating. But keep in mind that feedlot cattle are generally on that diet for only 5 months, so it's not an extended period of time. Just some thoughts about all this. But and then so I was involved in the dairy export business, live cattle, for a long time. And you want a real nightmare, you take an animal that has a biome in her gut and export them to the Middle East, and they've got to reinvent their whole internal system, has to be reinvented to create a new biome to take the feeds they're feeding them there and turn them into productivity. So, and that can happen within the US too. If you take a beef animal from Montana, bring them to the East Coast, they do not do well for a couple of years. It takes that long for the biome to readjust. So it's very site specific. I know it's a lot of information, but it's a complex issue.
It's very complex. And then when you're thinking about product development, you know, people just want this like thing that works everywhere. And it's hard because it's like, well, I know the total addressable market looks huge when you're looking at global cattle. But then when you start chipping away, like Ewing said, everyone's like, well, let's just feed the methane reducer to the feedlot steers. But just like he said, that is the system in which produces the least amount of methane. But it's the easiest to get into the beef steer because they're eating out of a trough, right? How are you getting these technologies into a pasture-based ranching system?
Even if you wanted to try, you know, I mean, it sounds like good luck on that one too.
So
Ben, I'm sorry,
go
ahead.
Going on, Andrew, I'm just going to mention this really quick, is we live in this world where all of us have to monitor the information that's put in our brains. And there's all these people that are trying to influence the way people think and outcomes. And I find it interesting that I read these articles now where they want to repopulate bison herds in the West because they're carbon negative. And I'm going, they're ruminants. So what's the difference? So I'm still trying to figure that one out. But just a little thought.
Ben, I'm going to call on you since you were kind enough to write a question in there. And I know Whitney, you had your hand up as well. So Ben, go ahead.
Yeah. Whitney, thanks so much for that talk. So awesome, and I learned so much. One thing I was curious about, so I've heard of carbon flux sensors being used as one input of, you know, a many input on-farm emissions models for measuring the CO2 that's being emitted on farm. I'm curious how those type of sensors are being used for ruminants or methane in general.
I've looked into it at one point. The science behind it, I don't fully understand, so I could be misspeaking a little bit here, but I think the issue is most barns first of all, it's going to be dairy, right? Because dairy is confined into a barn, right? But most barns aren't enclosed, right? They're open. So they're having a hard time getting reliable measurements of the impact the animals alone have on the system, because it's really measuring the atmosphere around it as well. And so there's some back and forth with, well, what is really the impact of these animals? Is it lower than what it really is? Is it higher? And so it really just takes into account, like, how do you enclose the system and get a closed reading long enough for it to make sense?
Good, because I had no idea what he was talking about. I'm glad you fielded that one. Whitney.
I think you're calling on me because I was cheering. I used the cheer emoji, not the
Oh,
yeah, I saw Ben did it.
that was awesome. Anyway,
So,
well,
but
you got the
thank you for the
microphone.
wonderful
Go ahead.
presentation. No, I thank you for the wonderful presentation. I think it's an important piece that the more that we continue to advance the science and the more careful that we can be, the stronger our farms are going to be. And I think it's work like this that just keeps documenting and pursuing the conversations we need to have more confidence. Don't be afraid to say the bold thing. I think we have to start breaking up with doing things the way it's always been. And so I'm grateful for your research, and I just hope that we have bigger and better microphones for you to be able to share it through.
Thanks.
Well, good. I'm happy to hear that. I mean, this is recorded, so you can share it amongst your friends and on social media if you like. Keith, I mean, you certainly have a unique perspective. What are your thoughts? He just typed
thanks,
them
Andrew.
in.
I know. Well, I was just typing a comment that I did while I was listening to the presentation, and thank you so much for all that information. I typed out some questions that I like to ask these companies that are trying to bring these products to market. And maybe if I pose, I don't expect you all to comment on all of these questions, but maybe to give you a little bit of insight into what I think. And I'm certainly not qualified at the level of Whitney to dissect and pull these things apart. But at the end of the day, I got to make a choice as to what these people telling me, is it true? And I think distilling it down to its least common denominator, or its very basic, are the claims on the package understood at their simplest and common definitions? Are they accurate? Or does it require some type of linguistic jujitsu in order to get the claim to work? And I think we're all aware that these claims go to USDA, but anybody that's submitted label approval to USDA understands it's kind of a luck of the draw on who you get as your reviewer, whether or not you're going to get your claim through. You can just hang on and resubmit it in a month and get the same thing submitted. So I don't expect you to kind of go through all of those, but I thought maybe this is a little bit of kind of what I'm thinking, and maybe just tell me where I'm wrong, or if there's one particular question in here that you think it warrants some conversation here, I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead.
I put them in the chat.
Oh.
Sorry.
Keith, they're amazing, because that's a lot of the justification for a lot of the stuff that farmers have to deal with on a daily basis about how you're supposed to change the way you do everything. But we're not going to pay you anymore for what you produce. You just got to figure out, or as a retailer, we're not going to actually provide you with a way to gain more value out of the system. You just have to do this because this is what we tell you it needs to be. So it's really difficult.
Yeah, and if you add attributes to a product, you can generally leverage some higher price out of that, but you can't leverage a higher price out of a cohort's passion. You know, they may be passionate about that thing, but when that cohort is limited in numbers, they're just not representative of the larger, group of people shopping for these products. And I think if the cohort is very limited, it's hard to monetize it. It's just you can't spread that cost across that limited group of people. And then you get into like a philosophical thing, which should you require people who are not interested in purchasing that product to shoulder the burden of that cost by spreading that cost out across multiple products outside of that product space. So, where you put the cost is a tough one, and there's different philosophies on that. And a lot of people subscribe to the philosophy that the user of the product should bear the cost of the product. And if it's a very limited cohort, like carbon neutral beef, it's hard to put all that cost into that one cohort.
So I'd like to bring up a parallel to this. And as we move forward with how our food's grown in controlled environment systems, when you control an environment and you put plants in there, they need CO2 from somewhere. So it's amazing that a lot of these controlled environment systems, especially high value systems like, better not say this on the air, but they actually burn propane at night. So there's enough carbon dioxide in the air for the plants to grow the next day. So there's some symbiotic systems they're working on now. One of the really big producers of carbon dioxide is the mushroom industry, because they use a substrate that you have to let it sit there for 2 weeks to make carbon dioxide in the system before you let the air in, and the mushrooms just bloom like crazy. So take that CO2 and put greenhouses next to your mushroom grow facility and use the CO2 out of that system to grow plants. So there's some interesting things that are being used with all this stuff to try to utilize these concepts.
Whitney, I'll pass the mic back to you since you probably had a chance to review these questions. What do you think? Are they robust enough?
Yeah, I really love them. I'm going to take the first one is all farm fuel consumed in the production of the beef considered part of this equation? Yes and no. When you break it down in like the pie graphs that I showed, right, you get really specific in terms of enteric methane contribution. That's just the methane produced in the rumen. So enteric methane equals rumen methane. But when you look at the carbon footprint calculations, sometimes the fuel is included, sometimes it's not included, sometimes, or I guess it's always included, and then people will retroactively go in and remove it, going, well, I have a feed additive product, fuel's not necessarily part of this equation, right? So it just gets really complicated really quickly. And I don't think people cherry pick, right? Because people then are going to go back and go, well, people are cherry picking the data, right? I hear that a lot as the scientist. You're cherry picking the data to make it say what you want it to say. But it's really based on what are the questions people are asking, right? So a lot of times people are asking the question, does this feed additive reduce methane? And people will be like, all right, let's just look at that. But then the other consumer people or the other important people of this conversation is like, but you just can't remove that because that's so part of the system. So I don't know, it's complicated. As Ewing said, this is a complex system, and it's the same troubles we have with carbon markets and methane and rumens is the same troubles we have with carbon markets and soil. Soil is ahead of the game. They're a little further down the road. So I do think there's some learnings there that we can implement into the methane conversation. But there's no easy answer. As long as people have answers, I think that's the key, right? So that you wrote out those questions. If they have answers to them, I think that's wonderful. Because sometimes people don't even have those answers.
I think sometimes what I run into there, a lot of these companies are not expecting these questions, and I think that their presentations that they develop to present to retailers, maybe their expectation is the retailer will take it at face value because the retailer is generally not qualified to challenge these types of claims. And when you start asking these questions, a lot of the presentations kind of fall apart pretty quick. So yeah, but thanks for what you said there.
Well, good. I appreciate everyone sticking around here for Whitney's talk. This is, I love science. I'm a geek, and this was beautiful. It was a whole area I didn't really know about, and I've learned so much, and I want to explore more and learn more about this. Whitney, thank you for sharing your experience, your knowledge, research you've done, and it's always exemplary. Thank you.
No problem. And if anybody ever has any questions or run into a situation where you're unsure, please just reach out, send me an email.
Well, do me a favor,
I'm-
put your last slide back up again, and then I'll end the recording on that one too, so folks then watching this later can contact you.
Okay, that's a good idea. Where'd my Zoom go? There we go. We'll just leave
There
like
it
that. And
is.
thank you everybody for coming. I'm so honored that people will show up to listen to me. It's a very cool experience, and I really appreciate y'all.